gals, we are back and we just finished week 5 of Isn't She Lovely?
That's right.
And so we have been unpacking this series on the church. And so it's been this great time just really to dig into God's word, to just hear both from the message on Sunday, just conversations we've had, again, to hear from Tom Craig and Amber Schaefer, and just unpacking just the perspective that they bring as part of this congregation,
for sure,
part of this church, and just hearing the way in which God has just worked in them. And just great conversation about that. And so coming to a close, there's just been so much, and probably one of the things that I know we've tried to sit with, I think, is a question that maybe people haven't even asked because they don't even know I should ask this. But this idea of, and Brandon unpacked some of this for us, but I'd love to just hear us talk a little bit about this idea of, so God is the God of seasons. And so sometimes there are seasons where, for whatever reason, someone leaves a church, and in this, I grew up in Akron, but I've been on staff here at NCC pretty much my entire adult life.
Which is wild. Can you quantify that just for giggles? Like, what is that exactly when you say your whole adult life?
Yeah, so I started when I was like 20. I'm about to be 34 here in mid-May.
That's awesome.
And so it is this weird thing for me of like, this is where I'm at. And obviously I grew up in a church in Akron, right? My wife actually grew up here, and so she has this funny, like, this is all she's known, and but for some, they leave for different reasons,
right?
And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. I know you are not from Ohio.
No,
and you've been on staff here.
It's 4 years.
4 years.
Yeah. But when this comes out, it'll be almost 4 years on the nose. It's pretty wild. Yeah, I mean, so my background, ironically, is not too dissimilar, minus the chapel. The crazy part is, like, I grew up in Central Virginia. My family was kind of like in the weeds in some of like the very southern, Bible Belt scenario there. And so we all, like all of us, up to my grandparents, literally moved at one point when that church was being started, and there were some other organizations around it. And so I would say, like, the wild part is like so much of my life was, very much like wrapped up in the one church that I worked for prior to coming to the chapel. And so, like, all that to say, you mentioned this idea of like growing up in it, right? And so there's always like these weird things that kind of are entailed with growing up and stuff. I'm sure, like, you could say it too. It's just like the way you see things when you're younger kind of informs a lot about how you feel about things when you're older. But I won't go too far into that. So, I mean, talk about your experience, and then I'll ping pong it back to me to see kind of what, but again, like you said, like God of seasons. So before I rattle it off there, you've kind of broken it down into 2 segments that, Pastor Brandon essentially has as well, as just when do you know to stay? When do you know to go? But we're not necessarily saying, hey, since you still work at the chapel, when do you know it's time to leave this place? But more so, it's just like, how have you known through maybe some of the more difficult
saying that
seasons?
Brandon would like bust in.
Yeah, right. He would. But how have you known that the faithfulness to the church is worth it? I guess that's a better way to put it.
Well, and I think even that question, like when we look at that, I think first probably something where I have stayed, but I think even the different perspective God has given me of like, there's faithfulness to a church, and there's faithfulness to the church. And so I think there's some of this, like, we need to remember that if you've been hurt by someone in a church, you haven't been hurt by the entirety of the church, his church. And I think that's something that maybe I didn't realize at times where there were hard seasons here. And to be honest, there were times where I was like, I just can't. Whether it's that I don't want to, because I think if we're honest, I think there's sometimes some of this starts with I don't like this. And it's more about me than me actually sitting with and like praying and fasting and saying, Jesus, are you calling me out of here? And so I think even some of that is, as I look back at things where think sometimes we have expectations of, we talked last week, this idea of diversity in. I think there are seasons sometimes when we leave because we get confused and think as though we are going to in a pastor, in a staff, in a congregation, that they are going to be the fullness of God. And so I think sometimes we get hurt because we place expectations on people or a local body that they can never be. And so some of that is like we're hurt because we are expecting them to be something they can't because they're not Jesus, right? They may have been saved by Jesus and redeemed, but they're not. And so it took me a long time to learn that one.
Well, the crazy. So I just want to comment on something. It's crazy. So it's weird that you brought that up, and I wasn't even thinking about this. So one of the things that, like I'll say, my wife Hannah and I, we've been married since March 9th for 10 years, which is wild to think because we think, when you have kids, time just like flies. It's like crazy. It just immediately expedites, especially when you have twins as your first couple kids. And so the wild thing is that the few times that Hannah and I have been able to do premarital counseling with people, the conversation comes up often. It's just like holding your spouse at a unrealistic standard. When God is not the center of your relationship, ultimately you begin to place the spouse in a position of expectation and reverence that you should be reserving for God. And so when they fail you, why are you mad? Like they're not going to live up to the standard that is impossible. That's not to say that we shouldn't have standards, but it's to say that be realistic on the fact that we're all in a process. So to your just equivalent here, why do we look to the church to behave like God himself? And that's not to say we shouldn't have standards, and it's not to say that we shouldn't consider the possibility that we're supposed to be all spurring each other on to a better way and a better way of inviting people into the grace that we've received. But when the church doesn't look completely perfect, you just took a bunch of imperfect people to serve a perfect God, but that doesn't make them perfect people by consequence.
Well, I think, like, to answer your question, and we've talked about this, is we have this false idea. I don't want to make this up, but it's the consumer mindset.
Sure, right.
And so it's, well, I'm here and you are going to give me this. And if you cannot provide that, then I'm going to go someplace else. Because that's what we're so used to of, I bank here because of this interest rate, or this is where I got my insurance because I pay less. And if you can't do that, I'm going to go here. This is you're taking too long, so I'm not going to go to this coffee shop anymore because they don't make my drink the way I like it. And we carry that, I think, subconsciously, and we've never been asked, is this actually the way in which we are to view each other in the church? Because honestly, we probably aren't supposed to view each other that way in the world once we're in Jesus, but we don't push into that. And so I think that's some of it of this that has trickled into this. Well, you're the pastor, or you're the whatever your role is. I think you talked about this some of, we see people for their role. Instead of for the way that God has worked in them, and maybe even to bear with them in moments of we recognize that we are not done being sanctified. And so we have these seasons, and we need to say, maybe right now, it's this, it's, we miss that we just want to correct people sometimes. But Paul also talks about we need to pray for, to encourage, to build up. And so we don't get to do one without doing all of those.
Absolutely.
We miss that. And so I think that's hard. And I think some of this plays into why for most of us, it's really hard to understand and discern some of those seasons. I think even being honest, for us here to understand, what does it mean to be in trial and tribulation? Because I've never woken up with threat to my life because I'm following Jesus.
When we're afforded
threat to freedom versus threat to life is different. And I witnessed this when I was right after I graduated. So I was late graduating as a senior just because I was late going to kindergarten, but going to India, leading this youth conference thing. And so one of the villages, I remember there were guys that had been driven out of their village because they were trying to proclaim Jesus. And so literally had almost died, and they wanted to sit and listen to a bunch of seniors from Akron area, Ohio. And I remember like me and my buddy saying like, you should be telling us about Jesus.
Absolutely.
But it was this idea that because of whatever, I am somehow like on this higher level. I was like, I don't know. It's like, I have never been driven out of my hometown.
Right.
Got on a train and then wanted to sit and like worship. And yeah. And so I think even in that, it can be hard.
Yeah.
But we have to recognize that God has placed us here.
Yeah.
In this space for this season.
Yeah.
And there are times where seasons do end.
Yeah.
And so maybe if we could press into that a little bit, I think remembering this, like God's faithful throughout. And so whether we make choices that maybe were wise or weren't wise, that he is the God that redeems and works all things for his good and for his glory.
Yeah. Well, let me take the buck for that for a second before we completely transition to what a good idea of bouncing to another church is, because I think that you just like brushed up against perception. Like perception is a wild thing. I think that Satan uses perception to literally get at us to make mountains out of molehills. You know, I don't think that statement exists for not. It means something. I think that, you know, when you're in places, like you said, where your freedom and your life are threatened, like your ability to worship is not explicitly all that's at stake. It's literally your existence, and you begin to think in desperation, how do I get into a community of believers because I need God. It's not a matter of does the coffee taste good, it's a matter of who cares about coffee. Like we're dealing with the basis of what this is and faith in Jesus. And so I think that using that as a springboard, like I'll just say that like in the same way, I can't fully say that my freedom or my existence was threatened under the thought of faith being my guiding rudder. One of the things that I'll say, so like I mentioned this idea, and just to tee it up, I'm just going to spoiler alert say that in hindsight, I can't fully say that if I were to redo my life over and know some of the things I know now, that I would have made the choices I made relating to moving to the North Canton Chapel. Like, it's great that we're here talking. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm super excited that, you know, we're having a conversation and that this dialogue is happening so people can hear what we're talking about. But all to say is, like, the premise of, like, mountains out of molehills, I think is very, like, real in my mind. You know, living in Virginia and being a part of things, I mentioned this idea of how when you're younger, a lot of times your angst and how you see things growing up in the briar patch, you kind of see things a certain way. And like we've talked about before, sometimes God gives convictions to you that other people don't immediately have the moment that you do. And that's not to say that you're wrong or that they're wrong. It just means that sometimes we all need to be brought into the fold, and if it's a worthwhile endeavor, sometimes you have to take the time to explain it. I think that a lot of my reason for leaving was because of that. I was so, it was a me thing for sure, right? I think that when you really break down what the basis of church should be, Pastor Brandon has talked about a ton of stuff relating to this concept of dogma, doctrine, and preference, right? At the earlier portions of like us doing Touchpoint for this series, he broke that down. And then in an earlier portion, almost, I would say like a year and a half ago was the first time he brought that into conversation. And so with us, North Canton Chapel being a non-denominational church, you get this really interesting stew of different things, different places. You know, it's not in all of us are constantly looking through the lens of, okay, what is dogma? What is doctrine? What is preference? And knowing that we approach this idea of church through the beautiful lens of non-denominational, you know, how are we stewarding those first two things the best, you know, dogma and doctrine. And so off of that, though, the dogma and doctrine sometimes informs what level of ministry we do, right? I think that our emphasis on global missions is very apparent. Our emphasis on, you know, the Great Commission is very apparent. We want to have as many irons in the fire for that as we can, and we try to do that. We have, you know, between working with Refuge of Hope and a variety of other local opportunities, we do that just as much here as we attempt to try and do with missions partners abroad. In the same way too, you know, why do we care about the next generation? Because the Bible very strongly states that that is the thing that Jesus would care for, is that rearing this next generation to extend the gospel beyond the moments and days in which we live. And so all of these things we start to see. But if there was a pie graph, right, do we have it for each year, maybe in retrospect, we could do is there a pie graph that says how much of what thing gets what at what time? No. And each year we hope for a certain like level based on just whatever we've quantified. But how is God going to act inside of that?
Yeah.
And how is God going to move within you and me and our missions and group life pastor Alex and everyone else that's on staff, John Mangrum, our care and counseling pastor? Each person, every time we walk into a new year of ministry, doesn't fully know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And we just ebb and flow with what God has for us. But the real trick here is that we're always working within a church of people that have an idea about what the right idea is. And that's tough. It's tough. And when people's experiences of other churches that they've seen and they've been like, man, that's fantastic. That's amazing. I love how they do this ministry this way. Or I loved the worship that was this way. Man, that was great when they did that key change in that one song. Man, I loved the choir. Man, the way the person led that song or this song on that day. I think that so much of what we have impacted in our lives in the past sometimes dictates how intense we are about things for how people should be doing things in the future. And so rather than continuing to ramble, my whole thing is like, I just had a strong passion to reach young people in a way that I don't think I ever made super clear to other people. It gets into this whole thing of like being a part of certain things and seeing certain pains and certain hurts. And like I said, sometimes God will convict people, over certain things that not everybody else sees clearly yet.
Yeah.
And who are we to get mad when people don't understand what they don't understand, right?
Yeah.
This will be the third time I've referenced this in the last month. In John Piper's book, Desiring God, he talks about the idea of spiritual maturity and this idea of don't be mad at babies for wanting milk, Yeah. And that's biblical just as much as it is just like a punk rock way of saying, why are you getting mad at people? You haven't brought them to a position of understanding and they haven't done the, spiritual scripture work to understand what the better way is. And realistically, I would just say that as I'm looking back on my time having moved and been here, now sitting with you, I think that patience is such a amazing virtue that Western culture does not teach. And I would say that the God of the Bible is patient with us.
Yeah.
He's patient in our sin. He gives us grace when we don't deserve it. And to your point, when you said all the things you said about how we sit in a church full of, people that serve a perfect God.
Yeah.
But we got to realize where we are at in this process.
Yeah.
I think if we forget that we're all working towards better understanding what God's call is on our lives, better, being crafted into what God would have us be, fully seeing that the giftings he gives us is what we should rest our identity in and not just the songs, everything like that.
And I think, even as you're talking about like, right. So convictions, I think sometimes we can confuse, is this something that God has entrusted the North Canton Chapel to, or is entrusted me? I think sometimes that's what's hard of like, if we're waiting for a local church to do something, I think that's why we get frustrated or leave. Because like, well, you should do this. And there's something about like, if you are a part of the church, you don't need like my branding or my stamp. And I think that's sometimes where we have set, but then it's like, if it's actually of God, he's going to make it happen. Yeah. And so I think there's that tensions and nuances of like, what is just the reality of like institutional church and what is this where God has placed his burden and trusted these specific people to you, maybe as an extension, but I think sometimes we feel it's like, that's something I've always been like, you don't need to wait till someone can make room in their schedule to show up to a Bible study here with them. Like, you have God's word and you can sit with them and you can step out into that. And we want to come alongside, that's like equipping the saints for the work of the ministry. The work of the ministry doesn't have to happen inside this physical location, right? Absolutely. Going back to Amber talking about that it's beyond just a building. And so that's good. But I think you're right. It is really hard because we do have this conviction that is from the Holy Spirit. And sometimes we just have never been shown or taught how do I hold this rightly in context of the church as a whole, when maybe it's something that over here, Because I think it can be, I'm going to be disobedient if I don't step into this.
Yeah.
But then we can also become frustrated and then maybe like sin against our brothers or sisters because we get mad because, well, why don't you care about this?
Yeah.
And we miss that our good Father entrusted this work to us in this space. And he also maybe entrusted this different space and these different people to them.
Sure.
And that we're not in competition.
Yeah.
We're just working different fields for the same harvest.
So in the kind of thing, I wouldn't, this obviously isn't a disagreement. It's just mostly a call to consider from the way that sometimes people perceive church, especially larger ones, right? Like North Canton Chapel is not a small church. I think we sometimes like lose sight of that when we're in it. But when you are considered, I forget what the percentage, and definitely it's probably not right now, but if you're a church over 300, you are in a severe minority in this day and age. And so the real kind of thing here is like, if I were a kid and I said, what do I want to do with my life? Oh, I want to play football. There's an organization that comes to mind, right? I think I want to play in the NFL, or, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to play, and so in the same way, there are a lot of things in culture that tell us that if we want to get anything done, we got to do it the right way. And if we want to get anything done, we've got to do it a certain way, that it's in affiliation and in line and consider it to a certain thing and in a place. And, if you want, and this is why the crazy part of like, you can be a fantastic Christ-following, disciple-making person and not work in a church.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes we lose sight of that. But along with that too, exactly what you're saying. It's just like there is this innate like impulse for us to think that if I'm to do anything of significance in a ministry context, I need to get in touch with this pastor, with this thing and this affiliation. And so to kind of like bookend my whole thing is like, I believe that prayerful consideration about if you're wanting to leave at all is legitimate. But more than that, it's just like, what am I actually, like, let's distill it down into like some action steps. What am I actually throwing a fit about? And is it breaching dogma or doctrine? Is it like faith breaking what's happening here? Or is it something that's preference? I wish they did it this way, or I wish people would pay more attention to this stuff. Because ultimately there are some things that you're saying, Matt, and that hopefully I'm saying clearly here, is that like, I think we have more capacity with the Holy Spirit and more drive and calling that God puts on us than sometimes we give ourselves credit for. And we lean onto the church to make up for that. It's not, I wouldn't explicitly call it consumerism, but it's like a stunted production of what God could be doing in you.
Yeah.
No,
that's a good word. So as you sit with, so maybe someone sitting here listening, looking back now, and I'll share, it's like, what do you wish you could speak to someone who maybe is questioning, like, do I stay, do I leave? Or maybe they're still dealing with, wounds because they maybe feel like I stayed when I should have left, or I left when I should have stayed. Is there anything that, looking back now, and obviously not like, we're not old, we're just older.
Right.
But is there anything that, looking back, that maybe someone listening just like questions that you would ask, or prompts to pray, or anything like that, as you look back, if someone's sitting in maybe one of those spaces?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I would say is just like, a church is more than one action or initiative. Like, things can be done one time a way that isn't the most exciting, but it doesn't mean the whole thing is falling apart. And that's where it's just like, look outside of your own moment for a second. When you're really in and pursuing being a community driven part of the church, it's not going to fall on whether the success, failure, interest, or disinterest of a thing happens. It's going to fall on your whole perception of what's happening. So I would just challenge, like, first off, and this normally when people are frustrated and want to leave, this isn't really the greatest thing to say. What is your involvement? Right? What's your involvement? If your hands aren't dirty, why are you mad at the people that are working the field? Like, what is that about? But that's just like a general, like, hey, consider where you actually are at in the process. But bigger than that, like prayerfully ask God, is what is happening at this church, is this you? Is this you? Unfortunately, there are some times, and Tom Craig mentioned this idea of being sleepy.
Yeah.
If you didn't hear that, 2 weeks ago, he spoke about that. But beyond that, sometimes it's more than being sleepy. Sometimes there are some not awesome things that happen that are maybe swept under the rug, and there is a discontent towards things that are happening, and it isn't being addressed appropriately, and it does feel like you would be doing the family of believers a disservice, and yourself and your family and everyone involved, by letting it continue without somebody saying something. And I can't speak to that situation specifically, but I think it's one of those things that if you've prayed through the idea, and for a fact that there is no interest in pursuing the right thing for the church at large, I think it stands to reason that that could be a reason, but I can't speak to that. I would just say that if God is at the center of it all, despite what a couple actions might be, then it's worth at least getting to the core and being involved in the things that are worth being involved in. Speaking so vague, but I would just say in hindsight, especially as like I grow out of some of my stuff, it's just like, I need to slow down.
Yeah.
I think we sit in a culture of people that just move so fast and don't consider a whole lot in the wake of like, go here, do this. You made a comment about customer service and how customer service is not really how we should be thinking about the church, right? And I think in a lot of ways I was quick to make decisions and complete life upheaval based on how not expedited some of the things I thought were a big deal were being dealt with. And I don't think that was fair to anybody, including myself, and if I'm being honest. And so I think as a active community member of the church at large, but also a church in the individual community you're part of, you owe it to anyone else to be slow to act, but all the same too, it's just like considerate of what actually is happening with God, and not explicitly just with the one moment you're frustrated at. Yeah.
No, and I think that's good. And I think, so I have spent my tenure of ministry here. Mm-hmm. And so looking back, I see like, I was young, I was 20 somethings, right? Me and James Talbert back in students and stuff. And so there's a lot we didn't know. We were trying, and looking back on, there's some situations I probably didn't handle well. But I also realized, when you look at this idea of the church as a whole, it was really easy for me to paint those who left or whatever. If it was a situation where, sitting with, I didn't believe I had done something wrong, but letting people paint a picture is really easy to slip into bitterness. And I'd say something God's still working on me is helping me see this reality of even in those moments where you do have that, to remember, if God's got a season and still working, that at some point, am I going to let him move me into a space where he deals with maybe the bitterness or unforgiveness in my heart? And I think sometimes that's really challenging.
Yeah.
Wherever we find, whether we've stayed or whether we've gone, is to figure that okay, right, sanctification, it's still this ongoing process for me and that person that maybe wronged me or I've wronged. And so do I seek forgiveness, but do I also, if someone is still in that spot, I think that was a moment where I remember walking in the hall here and getting almost triggered because I was like, I know what that person has said about me.
Yeah.
But then when I actually let Jesus do something, it was interesting. And this isn't me, it was only the Holy Spirit, because it was this different, almost like this, right? Brandon talked about this idea of care and concern. And it was man, I don't feel the same intensity. And it was just oh man, I hope they let Jesus do the same thing to them that Jesus has done to me, that I so needed, because I didn't realize, the life to the fullest I was missing when I was harboring that bitterness and unforgiveness. And it's really hard, because those wounds that people have done, or those things, those are real. We're not discounting that. But I think that's some of the hard reality of, if we're holding God's word, and that he's calling us to walk in him and grow in him, there will be a season, and maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 20 years.
Yeah.
But at some point, if I'm never, and I think that's the important of even like Sabbath and rest and being still,
there's that too.
To stop. You talked about
reflection,
going so
man.
fast. I feel that And I think that's why we don't like, because then when we're slow, like Jesus actually gets to speak into the parts of us that he wants to.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need when we're better as a church, to come together and see the beauty of who he is, that he's so much better than anything that we think would be fixed if our frustrations were answered. All those things of like, we see the beauty and that God is still working even in the midst of that he's the God that redeems and restores. And I think sometimes it doesn't mean that we weren't rightly frustrated, but maybe sometimes we can miss like that awe in that sense that God is still working and God is still redeeming. And I'd say that's something I can see just because for whatever reason, I've been here all these years and it's cool seeing people or spaces that I would have spoken wasteland over, that God has begun to plant seeds, right, and cause them to grow. And so it's this beautiful thing where it's like, oh man, like Jesus, forgive me, because I would have written this off. Yeah. And I've forgotten that you are the God that is still active and moving. And so, just thanks for sharing and speaking to that. And I think there is beauty in, specifically if you're someone who's like younger watching or like our age, like here's just real, like you can slow down and like you can pause on all the content and like just sit and be still.
There's that. If you're young enough to be even like considering your position in the church, like to the point of, I don't know, almost to the point of almost frustration, I would tell you stay involved. Like the amount of transiency, in other words, like the amount of people that are just dipping and diving over to other churches with whatever the next great thing is like, as a 32-year-old that's like watched it, it's just not worth it, man. Like I think you're going to create habits of disconnection, if you haven't already, that are going to extend into your adulthood and extend into how you deal with your marriage. And that sounds weird to say that, like how you deal with your church is going to be, representative of how you deal with other relationships. But I think it's real. And I would just say, I think that it's good in some ways, and always, I shouldn't just say in some ways, it's good that God can look at things that you're saying that if it were up to me, I would have condemned it or called it wasteland. All of these things, it's good that God does that because he does that with us. It's just a larger extension of what he already does in a biblical context for us. And the fact that we can look at that and say that that is true is a big deal. And so out of that, it is like what I said, if you're younger and you're at a position of like, it doesn't matter what I tie myself, it does matter. Because just as much as you think you don't need to worry about that, I guarantee you're going to wish when you were older. This sounds so old manish, but you know what I'm getting at here. It's like there is a lot of wisdom in staying around, and there's a lot of wisdom that can be learned through the people that have stuck around if you would just be willing to do it too. And so, but no, man. So, I mean, I know you were trying to bring this whole thing to a close. I feel like we could go on, especially if we got more specific, but we probably wouldn't want to record it. So all the same, Matt, I really have appreciated the time we've taken to kind of like break it down backwards and see, exactly our opinions and experiences on, what we maybe have done in the past that we didn't really love. And then maybe what we have been, looked back on and didn't think was super valuable, but then all of a sudden here we are on the other side and it was worth it. And so, this series, just like Matt was saying, if you're younger, I think there's a lot of time to invest into the church. And if you're older, you're probably listening to us going, well, duh, guys. But this series, Isn't She Lovely, I think addressed a lot of stuff. It is a series that could go on for a long time if we wanted to break it all down. But I think that the time we spent in it was well done. Right. Yeah, exactly.
And we're moving into a series that will go on for a long time. Ephesians are going through the whole book, starting mid-May all the way through the summer. But I'm super excited. I love Ephesians 2, 8 through 10. It's going to be some of my favorite verses. So
when we get to Ephesians 4, I'm very curious where we get with some stuff anyways. But all to say is that, it's going to be a fantastic series. So come along for the ride for Touchpoint. We're going to be stuck in Ephesians for a good while, in a good way, not stuck in a bad way. But all right, catch y'all then.